We believe that she actually murdered him, and she took his body somewhere we don't know exactly.
The disappearance of a marine engineer would unearth a dark tale of greed, deception and dishonesty.
He said, "I'll see you in a few months, Roscoe." And I said, "Good on you, Carl, enjoy your time off." And that was the last time I saw Carl.
A brutal and violent crime would unravel a twisted web of lies.
There was blood spots found on the wall of the master bedroom.
We can reveal the incriminating documents discovered by police and how forensic investigators used them to track down a cold-hearted killer.
I could identify, that's a forgery, that's a forgery, that's a forgery.
The essence of the case is to identify the important pieces of the jigsaw and put them together and to produce one picture, the truth.
The case of Patricia Byers, who would become known as the Black Widow, was a crime that shook Australia. Carl Gotchins was a 51-year-old marine engineer from Yatala in Queensland. In July 1990, in the midst of relationship troubles, he was due to board a plane bound for Thailand. Almost 10 years earlier, Carl had left his first wife and their 2 daughters and started a relationship with Patricia Byers, who became his de facto partner. But by 1990, this relationship was also floundering. Carl had met a woman in Thailand, and he decided to end his relationship with Byers and move abroad to start a new life.
He'd been away on a trip. He'd returned to Harwood Island, and his employer at the time, Ross Roberts, had driven him to his house at Glen Osmond Road, Yatala.
When I dropped him home, he invited me in for a beer, but on the way to Brisbane, he had mentioned that he had been arguing a bit with Patricia, I suspect over the fact that he was going to Thailand. And I said, no, I don't think I'll come in. And that was the last time I saw Carl.
He'd booked a airfare to go to Thailand on Friday the 6th of July, and he'd arranged to meet his girlfriend, and he wasn't heard from again.
This tale of a relationship breaking down and a partner leaving for a new life is far from unusual, and the friends and colleagues of Carl Gotchins quite reasonably accepted it and got on with their own lives.
We realised Carl hadn't been there for a while. Trish said to us that he'd got involved a young lady in Thailand during his travelling, and that he decided that they'd part the ways and he would go and live there with her. We didn't think too much of it because he was away quite a lot, and we hadn't any reason to, challenge or question what she said.
We all thought that Carl had just moved up into Asia to work in the marine industry, which is not unusual for people of his age or his experience. There's many, many men in particular living in Asia who are Australian marine engineers because they're very sought after because of their ability.
And that's where the tale of Carl Gotchins would end, if it wasn't for a bizarre series of events in April 1993 on the calm waters of Moreton Bay on the Queensland coast near Brisbane. By then, Gotchins hadn't been heard from in almost 3 years. Carl's former partner, Patricia Byers, had seemingly come to terms with his sudden decision to leave her, and she'd moved on with her life. Just a few months after his departure, she had begun a new relationship with fellow insurance agent John Asquith.
Patricia suggested that they go off for a romantic weekend on the boat. It was a lovely night. They had dinner on deck, they made love, they had a shower on deck together, and then they went to bed. The next thing that John Asquith knew, he woke up to discover that he'd been shot in the head. The bullet had actually, by some miracle, had actually shattered when it hit his head, and somehow it hadn't actually killed him. He couldn't see Patricia Byers anywhere, so he managed to clamber out onto the deck, and he found her there slumped over. She said that she'd been knocked on the head and couldn't remember anything. She thought that they'd been attacked by pirates.
She had this story that they had pirates or somebody climb on board with her asleep at night and shot him, and she was drugged or she was drunk and didn't wake up.
Amazingly, John Asquith was alert enough and well enough to be able to call the Coast Guard and get help.
Local police responded to the alleged pirate attack with immediate suspicion. Whilst Asquith was lucky to be alive, medics could find nothing physically wrong with Byers, despite her claims of being attacked.
So the police obviously had to look at, what had gone on. Had there been pirates, although, Moreton Bay is not really known for piracy. Maybe it was kids fooning round, but again, there were no reports of that. So they had to look a little more closely at what had actually gone on. John Asquith claimed that he'd seen a gun below deck. But by the time the Coast Guard arrived, there was no sign of the gun. The Coast Guard actually searched overboard but couldn't find the gun anywhere. And Patricia Byers said that she hadn't seen it.
Asquith was convinced he'd seen a gun below deck, and the fact that it had now disappeared only intensified police's suspicions. Their concerns grew when they were made aware of Patricia Byers' behaviour towards her supposed lover.
Patricia Byers told John Asquith to retract his statement to police. She wanted him to lie and say he hadn't seen a gun on the boat.
Faced with a version of events that was becoming increasingly harder to believe, police decided to cast the net further in an effort to work out exactly what had happened on board the boat.
So one of the avenues of inquiry that the police did pursue was John Asquith's finances. Was there a financial motive that someone wanted him dead?
What police discovered was that Asquith had not just one life insurance policy in his name. They found there were actually 5. The first was taken out shortly after the start of their relationship. The last was dated less than a month before the ill-fated boat trip. All bore a signature that looked a little like Asquith's, but all were forged.
All of these had been taken out fairly recently, and John Asquith had no memory of having done so. So the question was, who would have had a motive to take out the life insurance policies? There were $275,000 worth of policy against John Asquith with false signatures. Someone had falsified his signature on these policies. Patricia Byers was involved in the insurance industry, and so she knew very much what she was doing when it came to things like life insurance. So looking at all the evidence the police had uncovered, it was pointing very clearly in the direction of one person, and that person was Patricia Byers.
This shocking turn of events confounded police, but their suspicions were confirmed when a chance discovery in a nearby river sealed Byers' fate.
Well, actually, my son had been down to the riverbank fishing with his mates. They'd found this rifle butt. Then subsequently, they sent divers in and they found the rifle barrel in the river, which was stuck in the mud. And they put 2 and 2 together and said, obviously, a rifle had been sawn off.
Prompted by the ongoing investigation into Byers, forensic officers attempted to link the remains of the gun to their suspect.
And through some amazing investigative work, detectives were actually able to match the pieces of the gun that were found in the river with some shavings, wood shavings, that were found in the basement in a vice in the workshop at Patricia Byers' house. Forensics used that evidence to prove that it was the same gun that came from Patricia Byers' house that was used to shoot John Asquith.
With this piece of the puzzle, detectives could finally prove what had happened on board the boat that April night.
In reality, what had happened is that she and John Asquith had sexual intercourse. He went to sleep, and then she shot him. But the big mistake that she made is, well, first of all, she shot him at close range, but she shot him with a sawn-off gun. And the problem with that is the muzzle velocity is a lot less than if she hadn't sawn it off. And luckily for John Asquith, he seems to have had a thick skull, and the bullet did not penetrate his skull.
Byers was arrested and charged with the attempted murder of John Asquith. In September 1994, she was found guilty and eventually sentenced to 12 years in prison.
John Asquith sat in the Supreme Court to see the woman he once loved sent to jail.
Just relieved that it's all over.
Her motive for shooting him was $270,000 from 5 life insurance policies she'd forged in his name. Byers testified that Asquith had actually shot himself as part of a conspiracy by the couple to defraud the insurers. The jury didn't buy the story.
With a cold, calculating woman behind bars, police closed the case on Patricia Byers. That was until the publicity surrounding the trial prompted the family of a man who hadn't been heard of for 4 years to contact the police.
When we saw the article in the paper in regards to the attempted murder of John Asquith, we finally had some sort of clue to go on about my father's whereabouts. We just thought the worst had happened to him.
After the conviction of Patricia Byers for the attempted murder of John Asquith, by happen chance, police had come into possession of knowledge or information that Patricia Byers had been living in the residence of a gentleman by the name of Carl Gottschens.
Some years earlier, Carl Gottschens' family had actually contacted Patricia Byers to ask where he was, as they hadn't heard from him for some time. Byers told them that they had separated and he was now living in Thailand. His family took this at face value until the news broke about John Asquith's attempted murder.
Even though he didn't have a lot of contact with his family, it was out of character that there'd been no contact for 4 years. There was no reasonable explanation as to why this man basically disappeared off the face of the earth.
51-year-old Carl Gottschens disappeared from Queensland in July 1990. Amid rumours of a new life in Thailand, his friends, family and colleagues were all led to believe that he had moved abroad. 4 years later, Carl's ex-partner Patricia Byers had been convicted of attempting to murder another former lover, John Asquith, in an attempt to cash in numerous life insurance policies. Inevitably, Carl's family and friends began to worry that he had met a similar fate.
Carl was the sort of fellow that I warmed to rather quickly. He was a very good engineer, good sense of humour, and wasn't frightened to speak his mind.
Carl was a very pleasant fellow, very serious sort of man, I would say. We didn't see a lot of him, a lot more probably of Trish than we did of Carl, because he was away a lot of the time. He wasn't on the scene. We didn't worry too much about it, because he was away for weeks on end and a couple of months on end sometimes.
Carl had been married before, and he and his wife had 2 daughters. Although the relationship had broken down, he kept in touch with his children. Shortly after the marriage breakup, Carl met Patricia Byers and fell in love.
So Patricia Byers was an insurance agent. She was married before when she was 19, and her first husband died, so she was a single mother with 2 children.
Although life as a single mother was difficult, she refused to let it get the better of her, and she began a successful career in insurance.
Trish was very sort of outgoing, but she was probably more interested in being with the men because she had more in common with them. She didn't see herself as a homebody. She's very interested in being out in the yard, doing the manly things like brush cutting and mowing and laying walls and things like that, you know.
So Carl Gotchins and Patricia Byers met at a sailing club. They were both very keen sailors. And Patricia, they built up a business together. They were in a de facto relationship together. They shared a house.
We built the house in '88, the same time as Patricia Byers was building their house with Carl. We sort of got friendly as the house was being built. As a neighbour, Patricia was very, very good. We had no problems with her at all. She was quite helpful. We did socialise them a little bit, didn't go much further than that, but we did have a couple of barbecues and we found them very sociable.
First time that I met Patricia Byers was she came to the ship with Carl to drop him off, and we actually went out to dinner. I found her a very pleasant person. I didn't sense any problem between them.
But by July 1990, Carl Gotchins had decided the relationship had run its course, and he was planning to leave Patricia Byers.
Their relationship started to break down, and he was out of the country at sea quite a lot of the time. And I think it was on one of those trips overseas, he was actually in Singapore working as an engineer when he actually met and fell in love with an Asian woman.
Carl was due to board a plane bound for Thailand, but he didn't make the flight. The 51-year-old marine engineer hasn't been seen since.
So when Carl Gotchins left Patricia Byers, it came as a bit of a shock to everyone. Patricia Byers told people that he'd gone off to be with this other woman and that he was going to be on a boat and sailing. And Carl Gotchins' ex-wife and children weren't able to get in touch with him. He obviously hadn't contacted them, even though he usually rang the daughters for their birthdays. So no one had actually heard from him for a long time.
Prompted by the Asquith trial, Carl's family reported him missing to the police, who immediately became suspicious and started delving into the lives of Carl and Patricia. It wasn't long before a dark and twisted picture began to emerge. It portrayed a woman whose greed would lead her to commit an unthinkable act. The first clue that would unravel the mystery of Carl's disappearance arrived in the form of a letter, seemingly written by the man himself.
Ross Roberts, who was Mr Gotch's employer, had a number of letters that he'd received purporting to be written by Mr Gotchins. One of those was a typewritten letter.
And the letter was basically saying that he was moving on, he was going to work up in Asia, he'd been paid out some money for his house, and thanks very much and see you later.
Dear Ross, I would like to hand in my resignation. Ross, I hope you will have time to find someone else. An opportunity has come up in Southeast Asia and I feel I have to take it.
This struck me as very strange because we'd never had this conversation.
This opportunity was too good to miss. One of the partners died and it had to be quick. I was also lucky Trish paid me the money all up front in cash. She's been terrific and maybe I've made a bad decision. I feel bad, but she is smart and good looking. I can't see her being left on the shelf. I wish you all the best. Give my regards to everyone. I will keep in touch. Regards, Carl.
To all who knew the missing marine engineer, the plans he'd laid out in the letter seemed completely out of character.
The next step in the investigation was contacting Department of Immigration to find out if he had left the country. On the 6th of July 1990, he never made that Thai Airways flight.
One of the first things they did was to contact his Thai girlfriend, and she actually said that she'd had a phone call from an Australian woman saying that there'd been an incident and Carl Gotchins would not be joining her in Thailand after all.
There was no evidence that Mr Gotchins had ever left Australia, and there was no reasonable explanation as to why he had disappeared.
At the same time, police were beginning to intensify their investigations into Carl's finances.
We looked at his assets. He had a house at 25 Glen Osmond Road, Yatala, and we discovered that 3 weeks after he disappeared, the house was transferred to Patricia Byers' name. Bank accounts that he had in his name were activated. There was numerous cheques written on those accounts.
The more police investigated, the more they grew concerned for Carl's well-being. To detectives, the inevitable conclusion was that he had met with foul play. At the same time, one person was becoming the prime suspect. What police didn't yet have was a motive, but that was to change when a letter to Patricia Byers was discovered.
Prior to the disappearance of Mr. Gotchins, he had consulted his solicitor in relation to the separation from Patricia Byers. And there is a letter from his solicitor addressed to Patricia Byers, which states, "Our client instructs that the relationship between the two of you has broken down and the relationship which began in 1981 has now ended. Mr. Gotchins is hopeful that the relationship will end on an amicable basis, and the purpose of this letter is to set out our client's proposal."
This letter obviously unnerved Byers. In an attempt to find out how the breakup would affect her financially, she forged Carl's signature on a letter, securing access to his will.
Byers also knew that if Carl Gotchins simply died in an unfortunate accident, that she had to share Carl Gotchins' estate with his 2 daughters, and that wasn't enough for her.
So if Patricia Byers stayed with Carl Gotchins, she'd still get to enjoy the house, the lovely house, the boat, the car, all the trappings of a good life. If he died, she'd only get a fraction of the assets, the rest will go to the daughters. And of course, if he ran off with another woman, she'd be left with absolutely nothing at all.
At some point, she decided that Carl Gotchins had to disappear. The idea being he simply disappears, no one knows he's dead, and then she can use the opportunity then to transfer all the assets into her own name.
To the police, it seemed that Byers had motive enough to kill Carl, but they still needed proof, and so began months of painstaking work. While they may not have had a body, what they did have was a trail of paperwork that they hoped would lead all the way to the Supreme Court. Police investigating the whereabouts of marine engineer Carl Gotchins were growing increasingly convinced that his ex-partner Patricia Byers was responsible for his disappearance. They had evidence that his assets had been transferred to Byers and money had been taken from his bank account. Her claim that he had left the country for a new life overseas was also quickly proved to be false. Although they suspected Gotchins had met with foul play, police were lacking one thing: a body.
If there's no body, there are essentially 2 things that are central to the case. 1, prove they are dead, as opposed to simply disappeared. And 2, then you have to prove that they have been killed at the hands of a particular person.
From the outset, detectives began to discover evidence that pointed to Byers' involvement in the mysterious disappearance of Carl Gotchins.
When you look at the facts of the case, Ross Roberts dropped him at his home on Tuesday night, the 3rd of July 90. He'd made a booking to fly to Bangkok on Friday, the 6th of July 1990. He never made that flight. Several weeks later, his house that he owned at Yatala was transferred to Patricia Byers' name. Accounts that he operated at a number of banks and a credit account that he had with American Express was activated. There was numerous transactions on those accounts. At the beginning of the investigation, the only suspect was Patricia Byers.
Now, the question for police was whether they could build a case strong enough to convince a jury that their suspect was in fact guilty of murder. Byers was still in prison, following her conviction for the attempted murder of John Asquith, and she wasn't saying anything about Carl's whereabouts.
The investigation had come to a point where I thought it was necessary to execute a search warrant at Mr Gotchin's house at Yatala. Because we didn't have a body, there was the option that we might have to dig up the yard or search various places at the house.
There was some concreting done in the months following the disappearance of Carl Gotchins. The police did an examination of the house and the grounds and did not find the body.
And so began months of forensic investigation. They may have had no body, but what police did have were files of paperwork. These are some of the actual documents they discovered, revealed here for the first time, and they pointed to a chilling conclusion.
When I did a search warrant at 25 Glen Osmond Road, Yatala, there was a portable typewriter located at the address.
Investigators were already aware of the letter received by Carl's former boss that aroused suspicion. Was there a chance that it could have been written on this typewriter?
My examinations revealed that the typewritten letters were typed on this cheap manual portable typewriter. And there are a number of identifying features that, in my view, could say that that typewriter was responsible and no other typewriter.
The letter was purported to have been sent from Darwin, so it was odd that he's typewritten a letter in Darwin and the typewriter was found at his old address in Yatala.
By proving the letters had been typed on the typewriter found at Byers' home, detectives now had a forensic link between their suspect and the suspicious documents.
In effect, by that evidence, we could show that Patricia Byers was creating false leads or false trails to try and cover her tracks.
Spurred on by this discovery, detectives dove headlong into the financial affairs of Carl Gotchins.
The reason we went down the road of looking at his financial history was because when you look at the attempted murder of John Asquith, there was a financial element to that investigation. Investigators discovered that beneficiaries had been changed on life insurance policies and there were further life insurance policies that Mr Asquith was unaware of. So it was a natural progression that we would look at Mr Gotchin's financials. We got statements from his employer, statements from financial institutions. For a number of cheques that she'd wrote, we got statements from people that she dealt with, and it all led to Patricia Byers.
It was one of the biggest document examination cases in the criminal courts in Queensland, up to then and even since then. The forged documentation was used to transfer all of the assets of Carl Gotchins into the hands of Patricia Byers. That was the core part of the case.
One of the first tasks for police was to source documents that contained Carl Gotchin's authentic signatures. Once they had those, they then began comparing them to hundreds of documents that were flooding into the investigation.
In a lot of cases of forgery, forgers go about different methods. They use tracing lines or guidelines, or they use what we call simulations. They sit there and practice as best they can, using their own handwriting skills to imitate what the genuine signature looks like. Successful forgery, to beat a handwriting expert, is very difficult. As things progressed in that investigation, I became extremely familiar with Patricia Byers' handwriting and the way she forged Carl Gotchin's signature. When Detective Rosemary Walker was bringing documents to me, I would immediately, based on my experience and knowledge of Carl Gotchin's signature, that I could identify, that's a forgery, that's a forgery, that's a forgery. It's fair enough to say that she milked Carl Gotchin's accounts by forging his signatures on his bank accounts and using his American Express card. But the really hurtful thing was she forged his signature on the title to his property, transferring the title to her. So, from the way I see it, her motive was greed.
The final clue that brought Patricia Byers' house of lies and deception tumbling down was forensic evidence found here in her home.
They found droplets of dried blood on the wall. After all those years, very small and only a few. But the important thing was when the DNA extracted from those droplets was compared with the DNA of Carl Gottschin's daughters, those dried spots of blood were consistent with coming from Carl Gottschin's. That combines well with the fact that Byers ordered a new bed within a day of the date that the murder probably happened. And obviously, why do you order a new bed? Because the old one is covered in blood.
Frustratingly for the police, the search of the house in Yatala failed to provide any clues as to the location of Carl's body. But despite this, the strength of evidence they did have was enough for the detectives.
She was removed from Brisbane Women's Correctional Centre to come to the Watch House, where I formally charged her with the murder of Carl Gottschins.
The trial of Patricia Byers began in 1999 and lasted for 6 weeks. Prosecutors alleged that Carl Gottschins was murdered between the 3rd and the 7th of July, 1990. Byers had cruelly but effectively hidden his death from his loved ones for almost a decade.
There was about 100 witnesses called for the trial, and each of them came along and gave evidence of their involvement in the case, from the family to the forensic experts to his work colleagues to Commonwealth agencies such as immigration.
You see, the problem for Patricia Byers was that to produce the story that Carl Gottschins had simply left her and gone overseas, she had to tell different stories to different people. The problem for her was that when you put all those stories together in the one room, it's very clear that she's not telling the truth. I said to the jury that there were a number of forces at work. Greed, jealousy, bitterness. But on reflection, there's something else at work there that's revealed in the forged letter that she sent to Carl Gottschin's employer, where words to the effect of, "I might have made a mistake in leaving her, but she's smart, and I can't see her being left on the shelf." And one can't help but think that way of thinking is part of the reason for her bitterness and an element in the murder.
I find the letter to be quite self-serving in that Trish has described herself as being smart and good looking. I can't see her being left on the shelf. Yeah. I thought it was telling.
Despite protesting her innocence to the end, in 1999, Patricia Byers was found guilty of murdering Carl Gottschins and jailed for life by the Supreme Court in Brisbane. The jury were only told about her previous attempted murder conviction after she was sentenced. Carl Gottschin's body was never recovered. The sole clue to his final resting place comes, oddly enough, from Byers' own hand.
I located a 1990 diary which had been kept by Patricia Byers. On the 6th of July 1990, she made an entry that Carl had left and she'd dropped him into the city.
And the note's interesting. She says, Carl left. And then she's got, dropped him in the city, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. Drop him in the city is obviously code, particularly when you take into account the exclamation marks. Does it mean that she dropped him in the bay? Perhaps does the city actually have some meaning to her as some spot in the bay?
Other than this vague reference, Byers revealed nothing about what happened to Carl Gottschins. That was until 2016, when she claimed she was ready to reveal everything. Patricia Byers earned herself the nickname the Black Widow after being convicted of murdering partner Carl Gotchens and the attempted murder of another lover, John Asquith. She had effectively asset-stripped both men using deception and forgery. While Asquith survived the attempt on his life, Gotchens was never found, and Byers seemed content to take the truth to her grave until events in 2016 changed everything.
I find it very hard to imagine how someone could be so self-centred and so focused on money and so completely cold-hearted in getting rid of partners for cash. It's a frightening thing, and I think everyone is fascinated by the idea that someone who looks so normal could be a stone-cold killer at heart. Patricia Byers was in prison in Queensland for some years, but in 2009 she actually transferred to a prison in South Australia so that she could be closer to her son. Now, the interesting thing about that is in South Australia they have a law, no body, no parole.
The no body, no parole law is a South Australian law. It was brought into South Australia in early 2016. Queensland doesn't have no body, no parole. However, it applied to Patricia because she was domiciled in South Australia.
The fact that Patricia Byers transferred interstate to South Australia, where they enacted the no body, no parole legislation, has meant that she's had to admit to the murder of Carl Gotchens and provide an explanation as to where his body is.
Patricia Byers, in another twist in this very bizarre case, actually stepped forward and said, OK, I did do it. You know, I did murder Carl Gotchens. And this is a woman who had denied it vehemently and has always said, no, I had nothing to do with his death. Now, purely because of the parole laws, she has come forward and said, yes, finally, I did do it. And please let me out.
As a result of getting the request, Detective Scott Chapman went to South Australia and interviewed Patricia Byers.
She presented as a lady in her late 60s, early 70s. She was quite frail and also softly spoken. She agreed to participate in the interview, however, did not agree to it being recorded at that time.
Over the next few hours, Byers told her version of what had happened to Carl Gotchens.
She stated that she received a phone call from Carl Gotchens, who wanted to meet her at the Beanley rum distillery. She said it was about 5:30, 6 o'clock at night. She arrived there. She had a conversation with Carl and they decided to grab a 6-pack of beer and walk down to a wharf that was on the Logan River. Upon getting to the wharf, Patricia stated that her conversation with Carl became heated and she became very frustrated and very angry. She decided to walk away from the conversation. She returned to her car and she said there she went to the passenger side and removed a machete that she had underneath the passenger seat. At this time, Carl was sitting with his legs hanging over the edge of the wharf and looking out onto the river. She said she approached Carl from behind with the machete in her left hand and struck him on the back of the head. However, she stated she used the blunt side or the back side of the machete. She stated she didn't want to cut him and that she just wanted him gone. She said upon striking Carl, Carl fell into the Logan River, falling about 4 to 5 feet into the water below. She said she looked over the edge and Carl went under and never resurfaced.
After comparing her version of events with the evidence found during the murder trial, it was clear to detectives that Byers' story simply didn't ring true.
The scenario that was provided doesn't make sense. He was dropped at home on the Tuesday night. He didn't make the plane on the Friday afternoon. There was staining on the master bedroom floor which had been painted over. There was blood spots found on the wall of the master bedroom. That week there was a new bed that was delivered. So the scenario doesn't fit in with the facts.
My view is that It is unlikely that the body of Carl Gotchins is in the Logan River for the simple reason that it's a narrow body of water. It would be, quite frankly, a stupid place to dump the body because the body could easily be discovered.
Patricia advised us she was telling us the truth, and that she believed that DNA was in its infancy back then, and that she believed the case had been somewhat fabricated. I think it's a convenient answer for someone who doesn't want to disclose what's really occurred.
It doesn't make sense what she has said. It doesn't fit in with the facts. I don't understand why she just doesn't tell the truth.
Our suggestion back to South Australia in a nutshell has that she has not been truthful. With our investigators, with Detective Scott Chapman, she was not truthful with what we knew of the investigation, what we were able to prove forensically. That'll now be something that the South Australian Parole Board would have to consider. Only Patricia Byers would be able to tell us where Carl Gotchins could be, and we do not believe she's been honest with us up to this stage.
The location of Carl Gotchin's body remains a mystery. What is more apparent is exactly how Patricia Byers is viewed by those involved in her case.
I think Patricia Byers is a cold-blooded killer. While she's admitted to murdering Carl Gotchin, she hasn't admitted to murdering in the way that which we believe. So yeah, she's a murderer.
I don't understand why Patricia Byers just didn't accept that Carl Gotchins was going to leave her and let him leave the country. There was no reason for him to be murdered.
It's a vindictive, calculated crime by a woman who just had one thing in her mind, and that was financial gain.
And murder.
Yes, that's right, and murder.
She knew that the relationship was ending. She couldn't get what she thought she deserved simply by negotiating it with Carl. So she had to kill him. Simple as that.
The idea that Patricia Byers carried out this crime due to greed seems to have some foundation, particularly with the forgeries that have been uncovered in the evidence. It did point towards financial benefit. In that way, it's extremely sad that that's the price of a human life.
Hers is very much a cautionary tale that domestic violence and intimate partner homicide is a very shockingly common occurrence, particularly in Australia, and that evil can lurk behind the most ordinary of suburban doors.